My name is Sarah Matthews, and I'm 28 years old. I should probably start by telling you that my family destroyed me piece by piece. And the worst part wasn't the destruction itself, it was watching them smile while they did it. They wore those perfect practice smiles that fooled everyone around us, including myself, for far too long. I remember the exact moment I realized what they were doing to me. It was a Tuesday morning in October 3 years ago. I was standing in my childhood kitchen, watching my mother prepare breakfast with the same mechanical precision she'd used for decades. The bacon sizzled in the pan, filling the air with that familiar smell that once meant comfort, but had somehow transformed into something suffocating. "Sarah, darling," she said without turning around, her voice dripping with that honeyed tone she reserved for moments when she was about to deliver a particularly devastating blow. "Your father and I have been talking about your situation again." My situation. That's what they called my life, a situation to be managed, controlled, and ultimately solved according to their vision of what I should be. I was 25 then, fresh out of graduate school with a degree in psychology that I'd earned despite their constant undermining, and I was living back home while I searched for a job in my field. "We think it's time you considered other options," she continued, finally turning to face me with that smile. God, that smile. It was perfectly crafted to appear loving and concerned, but I could see the steel beneath it. "Psychology isn't really a practical career choice, and you're not getting any younger." The words hit me like physical blows, but I'd learned long ago not to show pain in front of them. Showing weakness only gave them more ammunition. Instead, I nodded and mumbled something about keeping my options open, all while feeling another piece of my soul crumble away. This wasn't the first time they'd dismissed my dreams, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. My entire life had been a series of these moments, small cuts disguised as loving guidance, each one carefully calculated to keep me dependent on their approval, while simultaneously ensuring I'd never quite measure up to their impossible standards. Breakfast scene was just another link in a chain that stretched back to my earliest memories. I can still picture myself as a 6-year-old, proudly showing my parents a drawing I'd made in school. It was a crude but enthusiastic depiction of our family, stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. I'd worked on it for hours, using every crayon in the box. "Oh, Sarah," my mother had said, taking the paper with the tips of her fingers as if it might contaminate her. "This is very creative, but don't you think the proportions are a bit off? And the colors are so bright. Real artists use more subtle tones." Even at 6, I felt the sting of her criticism. But it was my father's response that truly began the process of breaking me down. He barely glanced at the drawing before returning his attention to his newspaper. "Art is a nice hobby, sweetheart, but it's not something serious people pursue. You should focus on your math and science homework instead." That drawing ended up in the trash that same day. I found it there while helping my mother clean up after dinner, crumpled and stained with coffee grounds. When I asked her why she'd thrown it away, she smiled that same smile I'd seen countless times over the years and said, "Oh, darling," I thought, "you were done with it. Besides, we can't keep every little thing you make, can we?" The pattern was established early and refined over the years. They would encourage me to try new things, to explore my interests, but always with the understanding that these pursuits were temporary diversions from the real work of becoming the person they wanted me to be. Every achievement was minimized, every failure magnified, and every dream was gently but firmly redirected toward their vision of my future. Music lessons ended when I showed too much enthusiasm for the creative aspects and not enough for the technical precision they valued. Dance classes were discontinued when I preferred contemporary movement to the rigid structure of ballet they'd chosen for me. Writing, my first true passion, was dismissed as not a real job before I'd even had the chance to explore where it might lead up. By the time I reached high school, I'd learned to keep my true interests hidden. I wrote stories in secret, hiding them in a shoebox under my bed like contraband. I sang when no one was home, my voice echoing through empty rooms that felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. I drew in the margins of my notebooks, quick sketches that I'd erase before anyone could see them. The irony wasn't lost on me that I eventually chose psychology as my field of study. Perhaps it was my way of trying to understand what had been done to me, to make sense of the systematic erosion of my sense of self that had taken place under the guise of loving guidance. Or maybe it was my attempt to help others who'd experienced similar destruction, but even that choice wasn't truly mine. When I'd initially expressed interest in studying literature, my parents had staged what they called an intervention. They sat me down in our formal living room, the one reserved for serious conversations and disappointing relatives, and explained with painful patience why my chosen path was unrealistic. Literature is fine for people who can afford to be impractical, my father had said, his hands folded neatly in his lap. But you need a career that will provide stability. Psychology is much more sensible. It's still about people and helping them, but it has real job prospects. My mother had nodded along, adding her own observations about the financial instability of writers and the impracticality of pursuing art for art's sake. They presented their arguments with the calm assurance of people who knew what was best for everyone around them, and I found myself nodding along, agreeing to abandon another dream in favor of their approved alternative. The manipulation was so subtle, so wrapped in expressions of love and concern, that I didn't even recognize it for what it was until years later. They never raised their voices, never called me names, never used physical violence. Instead, they used something far more insidious, the slow, steady erosion of my confidence and autonomy, disguised as parental guidance and delivered with those perfect, loving smiles. Standing in that kitchen 3 years ago, watching my mother dismiss my graduate degree and my career aspirations with the same casual indifference she'd shown my childhood drawings, I finally began to see the pattern for what it was. But recognizing the problem and finding the strength to address it were two very different things. The damage had been done over decades, layer by layer, until I could barely remember who I'd been before they started reshaping me into their image of an acceptable daughter. The person I might have become felt like a ghost haunting the edges of my consciousness, always present but never quite real enough to grasp. The realization that my family had been systematically breaking me down didn't come all at once. It was more like watching a photograph develop in slow motion, the image becoming clearer and more horrifying with each passing moment. That Tuesday morning in the kitchen was just the catalyst, the moment when all the pieces finally clicked into place. After breakfast, I retreated to my childhood bedroom, which my parents had preserved exactly as I'd left it when I went to college. The walls were still painted the pale pink I'd chosen at age 12, and my shelves were lined with books I'd been allowed to keep, mostly classics that met with parental approval and academic texts that demonstrated my serious commitment to education. Conspicuously absent were any of the fantasy novels I'd devoured in secret or the poetry collections I'd borrowed from friends. I sat on my narrow twin bed, surrounded by the artifacts of a carefully curated childhood, and tried to remember the last time I'd made a decision based purely on what I wanted rather than what would please my parents. The exercise was more difficult than I'd anticipated. Even my choice of clothing, that morning conservative, slacks and a modest blouse, had been influenced by years of subtle guidance about what was appropriate for a young woman seeking employment. My phone buzzed with a text from my college roommate, Jessica, whom I'd grown distant from after graduation. She was inviting me to her engagement party the following weekend. As I stared at the cheerful message, complete with excited emojis and exclamation points, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt genuine enthusiasm about anything. That capacity seemed to have been trained out of me somewhere along the way. Jessica had always been everything I wasn't: spontaneous, confident, unapologetically herself. In college, she'd switch majors 3 times, dye her hair different colors on a whim, and date guys who made her laugh rather than ones who looked good on paper. I'd envy her freedom while simultaneously judging her choices through the lens my parents had given me. Their voices were so deeply embedded in my thought patterns that I become my own harshest critic. I spent the rest of that morning scrolling through social media, observing the lives of my former classmates with a mixture of longing and bewilderment. They seemed to inhabit a world where personal happiness was a legitimate goal, where taking risks and following dreams were seen as admirable rather than irresponsible. Their posts showed travels to exotic locations, career changes driven by passion rather than practicality, and relationships that appeared to be based on genuine connection rather than parental approval. When had I become so afraid of living? The question haunted me as I moved through the familiar routine of job searching, updating my resume with careful attention to the skills my parents deemed marketable, browsing job boards for positions that would provide stability rather than satisfaction, and crafting cover letters that presented me as the responsible, practical candidate they'd trained me to be. My mother called me down for lunch around noon, her voice carrying that particular note of forced cheer that meant she was pleased with herself for some reason. I found her in the dining room, which she'd set with the good china despite the fact that it was just the two of us eating leftover soup. "I've been making some calls," she announced as I took my seat across from her. "Mrs. Henderson from church mentioned that her son's accounting firm is looking for someone with your educational background. It's not exactly psychology, but it would be good experience in a professional environment." The soup suddenly tasted like cardboard in my mouth. "I appreciate the thought, Mom, but I'm really hoping to find something in my actual field." Her smile never wavered, but I caught the flash of irritation in her eyes. "Oh, sweetheart, you have to be realistic. How many psychology jobs do you think are available in this economy? Besides, working with numbers would give you such valuable skills. Mrs. Henderson says her son started his own firm when he was barely 30. The implication was clear. I should be grateful for any opportunity, regardless of whether it aligned with my interests or education. My desires were selfish luxuries that responsible adults didn't indulge. I'd heard variations of this argument countless times throughout my life, and the familiar weight of guilt settled on my shoulders like an old coat. "I'll think about it," I mumbled, knowing that my mother would interpret this as agreement and would probably have already given Mrs. Henderson my phone number by the end of the day. "That's my practical girl," she said, reaching across the table to pat my hand. "I know it's not what you dreamed of, but dreams don't pay the bills, do they?" That phrase, "dreams don't pay the bills," had been a constant refrain throughout my childhood. It was their answer to every aspiration I'd ever voiced, the trump card that ended all discussions about my future. The practical always took precedence over the passionate, stability over satisfaction, safety over growth. After lunch, I escaped to the local library, one of the few places where I could still feel like myself. The elderly librarian, Mrs. Chen, had known me since I was a child, and she'd always encouraged my love of reading without judgment about the practicality of my choices. She was one of the few adults in my life who'd never suggested I should be someone other than who I was. "Sarah," she called out as I walked through the doors. "How lovely to see you. I just got in some new psychology texts that I thought might interest you." Her genuine warmth was such a contrast to the conditional acceptance I'd grown accustomed to at home that I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Chun. I'd love to see them." As she led me to the new acquisitions section, I found myself telling her about my job search struggles and my parents' latest attempt to redirect my career path. She listened with the kind of patient attention I rarely received at home, nodding thoughtfully as I spoke. "You know," she said when I finished, "I've watched you grow up in this library, and I've always admired your curiosity about human nature. Even as a little girl, you were drawn to stories that explored why people do what they do. That's not something that can be taught, it's a gift." Her words hit me with unexpected force. When was the last time someone had spoken about my natural inclinations as gifts rather than problems to be solved? My parents had always framed my interests as obstacles to overcome rather than strengths to develop. I spent the afternoon in the library psychology section, reading about family dynamics and emotional development. One book in particular caught my attention, a study on how children's sense of self can be shaped by subtle parental messaging. As I read about concepts like emotional invalidation and conditional love, I felt a growing sense of recognition that was both liberating and terrifying. The authors described families where love was contingent on meeting specific expectations, where children learned to suppress their authentic selves in favor of approved personas, where criticism was disguised as guidance and control was masked as care. It was like reading my own biography written by strangers who somehow understood my experience better than I did. One passage particularly resonated with me. Children who grow up in emotionally invalidating environments often develop a deep mistrust of their own perceptions and feelings. They learn to prioritize others' opinions over their own inner compass, leading to chronic self-doubt and difficulty making autonomous decisions in adulthood. The description was so accurate it took my breath away. I'd spent my entire adult life second-guessing myself, seeking external validation for every choice, and feeling paralyzed when faced with decisions that my parents hadn't pre-approved. I'd attributed this to natural introversion or lack of confidence, but seeing it described as a learned response to invalidation reframed everything. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself making connections between my childhood experiences and my current struggles. The way my parents had dismissed my interests hadn't been random, it had been systematic, designed to keep me dependent on their approval and guidance. They'd created a cycle where I doubted my own judgment and relied on theirs, which they then used to justify continued control over my choices. The most insidious part was how they disguised this control as love. Every criticism came wrapped in concern for my well-being. Every dismissal of my dreams was framed as protection from disappointment. They taught me to see their limitations on my freedom as evidence of their care, and I'd internalized this message so completely that I'd begun to limit myself even when they weren't around. By the time the library closed, I felt like I was seeing my life with new eyes. The patterns that had seemed normal, even loving now, appeared in their true light as systematic emotional manipulation. But understanding the problem was only the first step. The real challenge would be figuring out how to break free from patterns that had been reinforced for over 2 decades. As I drove home, I practiced imagining what it might feel like to make choices based on my own desires rather than my parents' expectations. The exercise was both exhilarating and terrifying. After so many years of external validation, the idea of trusting my own judgment felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. That evening at dinner, my father joined the conversation about my career prospects with the same methodical approach he brought to everything else in his life. He'd spent 30 years as an insurance adjuster, and he viewed risk assessment as both a professional skill and a personal philosophy. In his worldview, the safe choice was always the smart choice, and the smart choice was always the right choice. Your mother tells me you're considering the accounting position, he said, cutting his meat into precise, equal squares. That's excellent judgment, Sarah. Financial services is recession-proof. People will always need accountants. I watched him eat with the same mechanical precision he applied to all aspects of his life, and I wondered when I'd stop seeing his predictability as comforting and started experiencing it as suffocating. I'm still exploring my options, Dad. I really would prefer to find something in psychology. His fork paused halfway to his mouth, and he gave me the look he reserved for moments when he needed to explain basic life principles to someone who clearly didn't understand how the world worked. Sarah, I understand that you're attached to your field of study, but attachment is a luxury you can't afford right now. You have student loans to repay, and you need to start building toward your future. Psychology is fine as an interest, but interests don't create financial security. The conversation continued in this vein for another 20 minutes, with both parents taking turns explaining why my priorities were misguided and their alternatives were sensible. They spoke with the patient condescension of people who'd had this conversation countless times before, not just with me, but with the imaginary versions of me they'd created in their minds, the impractical dreamer, who needed constant guidance to avoid making terrible mistakes. What struck me most was how they never once asked what I wanted or how I felt about their suggestions. The assumption seemed to be that my preferences were irrelevant compared to their superior understanding of what would be best for me. They made decisions about my life with the same casual authority they'd use to choose what temperature to set the thermostat after dinner. I helped my mother with the dishes while she continued to elaborate on the benefits of practical career choices. She told me about various family friends whose children had pursued sensible paths and were now successfully settled in suburban lives that mirrored her own. Her voice took on a dreamy quality as she described their achievements: steady jobs, nice houses, good marriages to appropriate partners. That's what real success looks like, she said, handing me a plate to dry. Not some Hollywood fantasy about following your dreams, but building a stable, respectable life that you can be proud of. I found myself wondering what she'd given up to achieve this definition of success. Had she ever had dreams that didn't align with respectability? Had she ever wanted to take risks or pursue passions that couldn't be measured in terms of financial stability? The woman standing beside me seemed so completely committed to her narrow definition of appropriate living that it was hard to imagine she'd ever been tempted by alternatives. But then I remembered finding an old sketch pad in the attic when I was 15, filled with detailed drawings of flowers and landscapes that were signed with my mother's maiden name. When I'd asked her about it, she'd dismissed the discovery with an embarrassed laugh, saying it was just a silly hobby from her youth that she'd outgrown when she'd gotten serious about real life. Had she outgrown it? Or had it been trained out of her the way my interests were being systematically discouraged? Was she perpetuating a cycle that had been inflicted on her by her own parents, passing down patterns of limitation disguised as wisdom? That night, lying in my childhood bed surrounded by the carefully curated remnants of my adolescence, I tried to imagine what it would feel like to disappoint my parents deliberately. The thought made my chest tight with anxiety, but beneath the fear was something else, a tiny spark of curiosity about what might happen if I stopped trying to earn their approval and started trying to understand my own desires. I pulled out my phone and did something I hadn't done in months. I opened the Notes app and started writing. Not a cover letter or a professional summary, but actual thoughts about what I wanted from my life. The words came slowly at first, rusty from disuse, but gradually they began to flow more freely. I wrote about missing the feeling of being excited about something, about wanting to work with people who were struggling with their own family dynamics, about dreaming of having the courage to travel somewhere I'd never been without asking permission from anyone. I wrote about feeling like I'd been living someone else's life for so long that I'd forgotten what my own preferences even were. The exercise was both liberating and terrifying. Each word felt like a small act of rebellion against the voice in my head that insisted my desires were selfish and impractical. But it also felt like the first honest thing I'd done in years, maybe decades. The next morning brought a phone call from Mrs. Henderson's son, just as I predicted. My mother had indeed given him my contact information, and he wanted to schedule an interview for the following Tuesday. His voice was pleasant and professional as he described the position, which involved basic bookkeeping and client interaction for his small but growing practice. "Your mother speaks very highly of you," he said. "She mentioned that you have a graduate degree and are looking for practical experience in a professional environment." I found myself agreeing to the interview while simultaneously feeling like I was betraying something essential about myself. The words came automatically. "Thank you for the opportunity. I look forward to meeting you. Tuesday afternoon works perfectly for my schedule." It was as if I'd been programmed to respond in these situations without conscious thought, but even as I made the appointment, part of me was calculating how I might use this position as a stepping stone toward something more aligned with my actual interests. Maybe I could gain some professional experience while continuing to search for psychology positions. Maybe I could save money to pursue additional training or certification. Maybe I could prove to my parents that I was responsible enough to be trusted with bigger decisions about my own life. The rationalization felt familiar and comfortable, which should have been my first warning sign. I'd been telling myself similar stories for years, that I was being strategic, that I was taking necessary steps toward my real goals, that temporary compromises would eventually lead to authentic choices. But somehow the temporary always became permanent, and the compromises became the new normal. After the phone call, I spent the morning researching the accounting firm online and preparing for an interview for a job I didn't want in a field that held no interest for me. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was putting more effort into pursuing this unwanted opportunity than I'd ever been allowed to put into exploring the career. I'd actually trained for my laptop search history told the story of my divided attention. Tabs for interview tips and professional dress codes, mixed with job boards for mental health positions and graduate programs in clinical psychology. I was living two lives simultaneously, the one my parents expected and the one I secretly wanted, and the cognitive dissonance was becoming increasingly exhausting. Around noon, my mother knocked on my bedroom door to check on my interview preparations. She found me surrounded by printed articles about effective communication in professional settings and tips for making a good first impression on potential employers. "Oh, Sarah, you're being so thorough," she said, settling into the desk chair I'd used for homework throughout high school. "This is exactly the kind of preparation that shows maturity and good judgment. I'm so proud of how you're handling this opportunity." Her approval felt simultaneously warm and suffocating. Part of me craved the validation after years of subtle criticism. Praise from my parents still triggered a Pavlovian response of relief and gratitude. But another part of me recognized the conditional nature of her pride. She was proud of me for doing what she wanted, not for being who I was. "I've been thinking," she continued, "that if this position works out well, you might consider taking some additional business courses. There are excellent online programs that could really enhance your qualifications. You could become quite successful in the financial sector with the right preparation." And there it was, the next phase of the plan I'd never agreed to participate in. My mother had already mapped out a future that extended far beyond the single job interview. A future that moved me further and further away from my actual field of study and toward her vision of appropriate success. I nodded and made appropriate sounds of consideration while internally marveling at how efficiently she'd co-opted my tentative agreement to one interview, and transformed it into a comprehensive career redirect. It was a masterful display of the subtle manipulation I was only beginning to recognize and understand. That afternoon, I called Jessica back about her engagement party. Hearing her voice bright and excited and unapologetically happy reminded me that there were people in the world who made decisions based on what brought them joy rather than what minimized risk. Sarah, I'm so glad you called back. I was starting to think you'd fallen off the face of the earth after graduation. Jessica's enthusiasm was infectious even through the phone, and I found myself smiling for the first time in days. I've just been figuring things out, I said, which felt like both a massive understatement and the most honest thing I'd admitted to anyone in months. Well, you have to come to the party. I'm dying to introduce you to Marcus. He's amazing. Sarah. He actually quit his job last year to start a nonprofit that teaches art to kids in underserved communities. Can you imagine having that kind of courage? I could barely imagine having the courage to order a meal I'd never tried before, let alone making a major life change based on personal conviction. But listening to Jessica describe Marcus's leap of faith made something stir in my chest, a feeling I dimly recognized as envy, not for his specific choice, but for the freedom to make any choice at all. That sounds incredible, I managed. I'd love to meet him, and there will be tons of people there from school. Remember Amy from our psychology seminar? She just got hired at a family therapy practice downtown. She said they're always looking for good people if you're still job hunting. The irony was almost painful. Here was Jessica, casually mentioning exactly the kind of opportunity I'd been dreaming about, while I was preparing for an interview in a field that held no appeal for me whatsoever. But the thought of reaching out to Amy felt overwhelming. What would I say? That I'd spent the months since graduation being slowly convinced that my actual career goals were impractical? After we hung up, I sat staring at my phone for a long time, Jessica's words echoing in my mind. Amy was working in family therapy, exactly the kind of position I'd imagined myself in when I'd chosen my graduate program. She'd made the leap from education to career in the field we'd both studied, while I was preparing to interview for a job that had nothing to do with helping people work through their psychological challenges. I found Amy's contact information in my old student directory and stared at her number for 20 minutes before finally gathering the courage to send a text. I kept it simple. Hi, Amy. This is Sarah from Dr. Martinez's psychology seminar. Jessica mentioned you're working in family therapy now. I'd love to hear about your experience if you have time to chat. She responded within an hour, enthusiastic about catching up and eager to share details about her work. We arranged to meet for coffee the following afternoon, and I felt a flutter of something I hadn't experienced in months, genuine excitement. About a professional conversation that evening at dinner, I mentioned the coffee meeting to my parents, carefully framing it as networking rather than job searching in my actual field. I'd learned to present information in ways that minimized their concerns and objections, another skill that had developed over years of navigating their expectations. That's wonderful, dear, my mother said. Professional networking is so important. Even if psychology doesn't work out as a career path, having connections in different fields is always valuable. Even if psychology doesn't work out, she'd already written off my chosen field as a failed experiment rather than a legitimate career path that I was actively pursuing. In her mind, the accounting interview was the real opportunity, and everything else was just keeping me busy until I accepted the obvious practical choice. My father nodded approvingly. Networking shows initiative. Employers appreciate candidates who understand the importance of professional relationships, regardless of the industry. They managed to turn even my tentative step toward reclaiming my career goals into validation of their approach to life. Everything was filtered through their worldview, where practical considerations always trumped personal fulfillment. And success was measured primarily in terms of financial stability and social respectability. That night, I did something I hadn't done since high school. I called in sick to a family obligation. My parents had planned to take me shopping for. Interview closed the next morning, but I told them I was feeling unwell and needed to rest. It was a small lie, but it felt like a significant act of rebellion. Instead of shopping for clothes to wear to a job interview I didn't want, I spent the morning researching the family therapy practice where Amy worked. I read about their approach to treatment, their specialization in adolescent and family dynamics, and their commitment to making mental health services accessible to diverse communities. Everything about their mission statement resonated with the reasons I'd chosen psychology in the first place. The contrast with the accounting firm couldn't have been more stark. While both were legitimate professional opportunities, only one aligned with my actual interests in education. Yet I was putting equal effort into preparing for both, as if my preferences were irrelevant to the decision-making process. Meeting Amy that afternoon felt like stepping into an alternate version of my life, one where I'd had the courage to pursue my actual goals after graduation. She was vibrant and passionate about her work, full of stories about clients she'd helped and challenges she'd overcome in her first year of practice. "It's not easy," she admitted as we settled into a corner table at the coffee shop. "The emotional weight of the work can be intense, and the pay isn't amazing, especially starting out. But Sarah, I wake up every morning excited about what I'm doing. I feel like I'm actually making a difference in people's lives." Her words hit me like a physical blow. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt excited about anything, let alone looked forward to getting out of bed. My days had become exercises in obligation management, moving through tasks that needed to be completed rather than activities that brought me joy or satisfaction. "Tell me about the interview process," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What did they look for in candidates?" Amy's eyes lit up as she described the conversation that had led to her hiring. The practice valued empathy and genuine interest in helping families navigate difficult dynamics over years of experience or prestigious credentials. They were looking for people who understood that real therapeutic work required authenticity and emotional intelligence, not just academic knowledge. "Actually," she said, leaning forward conspiratorially, "I think they might be hiring again soon." One of the senior therapists mentioned that they want to expand their adolescent program. "You should definitely apply if you're interested." The offer felt like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning, but I found myself hesitating. What would my parents say if I pursued this opportunity instead of following through on the accounting interview? How would I explain that I'd chosen uncertainty and potential financial struggle over the guaranteed stability of the business world? "I'm not sure I'm ready," I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. "I mean, I don't have any clinical experience, and I'm still figuring out my long-term goals." Amy looked puzzled. "Sarah, you were one of the most insightful students in our program. Your case study presentations were always brilliant. You had this natural ability to see patterns and family dynamics that the rest of us missed. Don't you remember Dr. Martinez saying you had real talent for this work?" I did remember vaguely, but those moments of academic validation felt like they'd happened to someone else. Years of having my interests minimized and my dreams dismissed had taught me to discount positive feedback about my psychological abilities while amplifying any criticism or doubt. "Besides," Amy continued, "clinical experience is something you gain by working in clinical settings. No one starts with experience. That's why they call them entry-level positions. The practice has excellent supervision and training programs. They want to develop people, not just hire finished products." Her matter-of-fact approach to career development was so different from my parents'. risk-averse philosophy that it took me a moment to process what she was saying. In their world, you needed to be completely qualified before you could even consider applying for a position. The idea of learning and growing within a role rather than arriving fully prepared was foreign to their way of thinking. We talked for 2 hours, and by the end of our conversation, I felt like I was remembering who I used to be before years of systematic discouragement had convinced me that my instincts were unreliable. Amy's confidence in my abilities was based on actual observation of my work rather than abstract concerns about market conditions and financial security. As we prepared to leave, she handed me a business card for the practice and encouraged me to reach out to the director within the next week. Don't overthink it, Sarah. Sometimes the best opportunities come when we're brave enough to take chances on ourselves. Driving home, I practiced different ways of telling my parents about this. Potential opportunity. Every version of the conversation I imagined ended with them explaining why pursuing psychology was impractical and why I should focus on the accounting position instead. Their voices had become so embedded in my thought processes that I could predict their objections before I'd even decided whether to apply. But for the first time in years, I found myself wondering what might happen if I simply ignored their objections and made a choice based on what I wanted rather than what they approved of. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. That evening, I sat in my car in our driveway for 15 minutes before going inside, trying to summon the courage to tell my parents about the family therapy opportunity. The business card Amy had given me felt like it was burning a hole in my purse, a tangible reminder of the choice I was facing between their vision for my life and my own long-suppressed desires. When I finally entered the house, I found them in the living room, my mother reading a magazine while my father watched the evening news. It was a scene I'd witnessed thousands of times throughout my childhood, the picture of domestic tranquility that they'd worked so hard to maintain. But now I could see the rigidity beneath the calm surface, the way they'd structured their entire lives around avoiding risk and maintaining control. "How was your coffee date, dear?" my mother asked without looking up from her magazine. "I hope you didn't let your friend fill your head with unrealistic expectations about psychology careers." The casual dismissal stung as it was meant to. She hadn't even heard about the conversation yet, but she'd already decided that any information coming from someone in my actual field would be inherently suspect. In her worldview, encouraging words about psychology careers were dangerous temptations that might lead me astray from the practical path she'd chosen for me. "Actually, she told me about a potential opening at her practice," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "They're looking to expand their adolescent program, and she thought I might be a good fit." The magazine lowered slowly, revealing my mother's carefully controlled expression. "Oh, Sarah, I thought we'd discuss this. You have a real opportunity with the accounting firm, a sure thing with good people who come highly recommended. Why would you want to complicate that by chasing after maybes?" My father muted the television and turned to face me with the patient expression he wore when he needed to explain basic logic to someone who was clearly thinking emotionally rather than rationally. "Sweetheart, you can't make decisions based on what your friends are doing. Amy's situation might work for her family's circumstances, but you have your own responsibilities to consider." "What responsibilities?" I wanted to ask. I was 25 years old, single, living in my parents' house with no dependents and no major financial obligations beyond my student loans. But I knew what he meant. My responsibility was to make choices that aligned with their values and expectations, to prioritize their definition of security over my own sense of purpose. "I understand your concerns," I said carefully, "but this is actually in my field. It's what I went to school for." "What you went to school for was a degree." My mother corrected, her voice taking on that sharp edge that appeared whenever I showed signs of independent thinking. Education is valuable regardless of how you use it. The important thing is to find stable employment that will allow you to build a responsible adult life. The conversation continued for another hour, with both parents taking turns explaining why the accounting position was the obviously correct choice and why pursuing psychology was a dangerous indulgence. They presented their arguments with the calm certainty of people who'd never questioned their own assumptions, and I found myself nodding along despite every instinct screaming that they were wrong. By the time I went to bed, I'd agreed to focus my energy on preparing for Tuesday's accounting interview and to stop getting distracted by unrealistic alternatives. The family therapy opportunity would remain as an unexplored possibility, filed away with all the other dreams I'd learned to abandon in favor of their approved plans. But lying in the dark that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the excitement in Amy's voice when she described her work. She woke up every morning looking forward to her day, while I could barely summon the energy to get out of bed most mornings. The contrast was so stark that it felt like evidence of some fundamental difference between us. She had the courage to pursue what she wanted, while I had learned to want what was safe. The weekend passed in a blur of interview preparation that felt more like preparing for a performance than getting ready for a genuine professional opportunity. My mother took me shopping for what she called appropriate business attire, a conservative navy suit that made me look like a younger version of herself. Standing in the department store dressing room, surrounded by mirrors that reflected my image back infinitely, I felt like I was watching myself disappear. "Perfect," she said when I emerged from the fitting room. "You look professional and serious. Exactly the kind of impression you want to make." But as I looked at myself in the suit, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was putting on a costume for a role I didn't want to play. The woman in the mirror looked competent and responsible, but she also looked like a stranger, someone who'd given up on her dreams in exchange for other people's approval. Sunday dinner was a celebration of my upcoming interview, complete with my father's detailed advice about salary negotiation and my mother's suggestions for follow-up strategies. They were so pleased with how I was handling this opportunity that their praise felt almost overwhelming after months of subtle criticism about my career choices. "This is exactly the kind of mature decision-making we've been hoping to see from you," my father said, raising his glass of wine in a toast to my bright future in business. "You're finally thinking practically about your career prospects." I smiled and accepted their congratulations while internally marveling at how quickly my reluctant agreement to one interview had been transformed into a celebration of my newfound wisdom. In their minds, I'd already accepted the job, built a successful career in accounting, and vindicated their years of guidance by choosing security over satisfaction. That night, I did something I'd never done before in my adult life. I seriously considered disappointing my parents on purpose. The thought was terrifying, but it was also strangely liberating. What would actually happen if I chose the psychology opportunity over the accounting position? Would they disown me? Cut off financial support? Or would they simply be deeply disappointed in a way that I'd spend years trying to make up for? I realized that I didn't actually know the answer to these questions because I'd never tested the boundaries of their conditional love. I'd been so well trained to avoid their disapproval that I'd never discovered what consequences would actually follow if I made choices they didn't approve of. Monday morning brought a surprise phone call from the director of the family therapy practice. Amy had given her my contact information, and she was interested in setting up an informal conversation about the potential opening in their adolescent program. Her voice was warm and professional as she described the position and their approach to treatment. "We're not just looking for clinical skills," she explained. We want people who understand that effective therapy requires genuine human connection. Amy mentioned that you have particularly strong insights into family dynamics, which is exactly what we need for this program. The conversation lasted 30 minutes, and by the end, she'd invited me to come in for an interview the following Thursday. Nothing formal, she assured me. Just a chance for us to get to know each other and see if this might be a good mutual fit. Hanging up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Genuine excitement about a professional opportunity. This was what I'd imagined when I'd chosen to study psychology, the chance to help people navigate the complex, emotional landscape of family relationships. It was exactly the kind of work that had drawn me to the field in the first place, but the timing couldn't have been more challenging. The accounting interview was tomorrow, and my parents were expecting me to approach it as my primary career focus. How could I explain that I'd scheduled another interview without revealing that? I'd never stopped pursuing psychology opportunities despite their repeated advice to be realistic about my career prospects. I spent Monday afternoon practicing. 2 completely different interview presentations, one focused on my transferable skills and interest in business applications, the other highlighting my clinical training and passion for therapeutic work. The contrast between them was so stark that it felt like preparing to audition for roles in 2 completely different plays. That evening at dinner, I made a decision that surprised me. I told my parents about the family therapy interview. Not because I thought they'd approve, but because I was tired of hiding my authentic interests from the people who claimed to love me unconditionally. I got a call today from the practice Amy works at, I said, keeping my voice as casual as possible. They'd like to meet with me on Thursday to discuss the adolescent program position. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. My parents exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation about my apparent inability to focus on appropriate opportunities, and I braced myself for the lecture that would inevitably follow. Sarah, my mother said finally, her voice carefully controlled in the way it got when she was working hard not to lose her temper. I thought we'd agreed that you were going to concentrate on the accounting interview. You can't be serious about both opportunities. You'll end up doing neither one well. I'm just exploring all my options, I said, surprised by how defensive I sounded even to myself. No, you're sabotaging yourself, my father interjected, his patience clearly strained. This is exactly the kind of scattered thinking that we've been trying to help you overcome. Successful people focus their energy on realistic goals, not on chasing every possibility that presents itself. The conversation that followed was a masterclass in subtle emotional manipulation. They never raised their voices or said anything overtly cruel, but they systematically dismantled every reason I had for being interested in the therapy position. The salary was too low, the work was too emotionally demanding. The field was oversaturated with qualified candidates, and I was setting myself up for disappointment by pursuing something so competitive. We just want what's best for you, my mother concluded, reaching across the table to pat my hand in what was meant to be a comforting gesture. And sometimes what's best isn't what feels most appealing in the moment. That's why you have parents to help you see the bigger picture when your emotions are clouding your judgment. By the end of dinner, I'd agreed to postpone the therapy interview until after I'd heard back from the accounting firm. It was presented as a compromise, a way to keep my options open while still prioritizing the more practical opportunity. But I recognized it for what it was, another way of ensuring that I'd choose their preferred path by making the alternative seem impossible to pursue seriously. That night, I lay in bed replaying the conversation and marveling at how skillfully they'd turned my excitement about the therapy position into evidence of my poor judgment. They'd made me feel selfish for wanting to pursue meaningful work and irresponsible for considering a career that aligned with my education and interests. Tuesday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. I put on the navy suit my mother had chosen, styled my hair in the conservative way she'd suggested, and practiced the talking points we'd rehearsed about my interest in business applications and my commitment to professional growth. Looking in the mirror, I barely recognized the person staring back at me. The accounting firm occupied the third floor of a modest office building downtown, and the waiting area was decorated in shades of beige and gray that seemed designed to convey serious competence without any hint of creativity or warmth. As I sat waiting for my interview, surrounded by trade publications about tax law and financial planning, I tried to imagine spending my days in this environment. Mr. Henderson turned out to be exactly what I'd expected: a pleasant, middle-aged man who spoke about numbers with the kind of enthusiasm I reserved for discussing psychological theory. He was genuinely nice, clearly competent in his field, and obviously sincere in his desire to find the right person for the position. Under different circumstances, I might have appreciated his straightforward approach and genuine interest in helping me understand the role. The position would start with basic bookkeeping and client interaction, he explained, but there's real room for growth here. I'm looking for someone who wants to build a career in financial services, not just someone who needs a temporary job while they figure out what they really want to do. His emphasis on commitment and long-term thinking was clearly meant to assess my seriousness about the opportunity, and I found myself giving all the right answers about my interest in the business world and my appreciation for the stability that financial services could provide. The words came easily because I'd been practicing them for days, but they felt like lines from a script rather than genuine expressions of my interests. The interview lasted an hour, and by the end, Mr. Henderson was clearly impressed with my qualifications and presentation. "I'll be honest, Sarah," he said as he walked me to the elevator. "You're exactly the kind of person I was hoping to find. Professional, educated, and serious about building a career. I should have a decision by the end of the week." Driving home, I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and dread. I'd performed well in the interview, demonstrated my professionalism, and made a positive impression on a potential employer. By any reasonable measure, the morning had been a success. But the success felt hollow, like winning a contest I'd never wanted to enter. My parents were waiting for me when I got home, eager to hear about every detail of the interview. I gave them the full report, Mr. Henderson's positive response, the interesting challenges of the position, the potential for professional growth within the firm. They listened with the kind of focused attention they usually reserved for news that validated their worldview, and their pride in my performance was palpable. "This is wonderful, Sarah," my mother said, actually clapping her hands together in delight. "You can see how much better things go when you focus your energy appropriately. I have a good feeling about this opportunity." "Mr. Henderson sounds like exactly the kind of mentor you need," my father added. "Someone who understands the importance of building a solid foundation before taking on bigger challenges. This could be the start of something really significant for your future." Their enthusiasm was infectious, and for a moment, I almost let myself get caught up in their vision of my bright future in business. It would be so much easier to accept their plan, to let them guide my choices and take responsibility for the outcomes. The weight of making my own decisions and living with the consequences felt overwhelming compared to the simple clarity of following their approved path. I remembered Amy's voice when she talked about waking up excited about her work, and the contrast made my chest tight with something that felt like grief for the life I wasn't living. That afternoon, I called the therapy practice to reschedule Thursday's interview. I told them I needed to delay until the following week due to a scheduling conflict, which was technically true, even though the conflict was more emotional than logistical. The director was understanding and accommodating, but I could hear the slight disappointment in her voice at the delay. Of course, Sarah, these things happen. But I hope we'll have a chance to meet soon. Amy spoke so highly of your potential, and I'm very interested in our conversation. After hanging up, I sat staring at my phone for a long time, trying to understand why I felt like I just made a terrible mistake. I was being practical, following my parents' advice to pursue the sure thing before exploring uncertain alternatives. This was exactly the kind of strategic thinking they'd been trying to teach me for years, but it also felt like another small betrayal of myself. Another moment when I'd chosen their peace of mind over my own authentic interests. The pattern was so familiar that I barely noticed it anymore. It had become as automatic as breathing to prioritize their comfort over my own desires. Wednesday passed quietly, with my parents treating me like someone recovering from a major illness. They were solicitous and encouraging, bringing me my favorite tea and suggesting we watch a movie together, small kindnesses that felt like rewards for my good behavior and pursuing the accounting opportunity. You know, my mother said as we settled in to watch an old romantic comedy, I'm so relieved to see you making such mature decisions about your future. We were worried for a while that you might make some impulsive choices that would set you back professionally. The casual reference to my interest in psychology as impulsive stung more than I expected. In her mind, my years of education and training in the field were reduced to a momentary lapse in judgment, something to be overlooked now that I was. Getting back on the right track that Thursday morning brought a call from Mr. Henderson with a job offer. The salary was fair, the benefits were comprehensive, and the start date was flexible to accommodate my transition. He spoke about the opportunity with genuine enthusiasm, clearly pleased to have found someone he felt would be a good fit for his growing practice. I hope you'll consider joining our team, Sarah, he concluded. I think this could be a really positive step forward in your career. I thanked him for the opportunity and promised to give him an answer by Monday, knowing that my parents would see any delay as evidence that I was overthinking a clearly beneficial situation. But I needed time to process what accepting this position would mean for the life I'd always imagined living. That afternoon, I drove to the university campus where I'd spent 4 years studying psychology. I parked outside the building where I'd attended my favorite seminars and sat watching current students hurry between classes, their arms full of textbooks and their faces bright with the kind of intellectual excitement I remembered feeling during my own undergraduate years. When had I stopped feeling that excitement about learning? When had education transformed from a source of joy and growth into just another stepping stone toward practical employment? I tried to remember the last time I'd felt genuinely curious about something purely for the sake of understanding it better, and the answer was both depressing and illuminating. Somewhere along the way, I learned to evaluate everything in terms of its practical applications rather than its intrinsic interest. My parents' constant emphasis on usefulness and marketability had gradually eroded my capacity for intellectual curiosity that didn't serve an immediate practical purpose. As I sat there watching the students, I realized that accepting the accounting position would mark the final abandonment of the academic path that had once brought me so much satisfaction. I'd be closing the door on psychology not because I'd lost interest in the field, but because I'd been convinced that my interests were less important than other people's definitions of appropriate career choices. That evening, I made a decision that surprised me more than it surprised my parents. I called the family therapy practice and rescheduled my interview for Friday morning. When I told my parents about this choice over dinner, their reaction was swift and predictable. Sarah, what are you thinking? My mother's voice rose several octaves, her composure cracking for the first time in weeks. You have a job offer from a respectable firm, and you're going to jeopardize it by playing around with unrealistic alternatives? My father set down his fork with deliberate precision, a gesture I recognized as a sign that he was transitioning into lecture mode. This is exactly the kind of self-sabotaging behavior we've been worried about. You can't keep jumping from opportunity to opportunity without ever committing to anything. But for once, their disapproval didn't immediately make me question my decision. Something had shifted during my afternoon at the university, some recognition that I'd been abandoning parts of myself that were too important to sacrifice for other people's peace of mind. I just want to explore all my options before making. Such a big decision, I said, surprised by how calm my own voice sounded. One interview doesn't commit me to anything. It commits you to being the kind of person who can't focus on realistic goals. My mother snapped, her careful composure completely abandoned now. Do you think Mr. Henderson is going to wait around while you indulge every whim that crosses your mind? This is how people end up with no options at all. The conversation escalated from there, with both parents taking turns explaining why my behavior was irresponsible, short-sighted, and indicative of the immature thinking they'd been trying to help me overcome. They spoke with the frustrated urgency of people watching someone make an obvious mistake, and their concern felt genuine, even as their approach felt suffocating. But something had changed in me during that afternoon of reflection. Their arguments, which had always carried such authority in my mind, now sounded more like opinions than universal truths. Their certainty about what was best for me began to seem less like wisdom and more like an inability to imagine that their worldview might not be the only valid one. I understand that you're worried, I said when they finally paused for breath, but this is my decision to make. I appreciate your concern, but I need to explore this opportunity. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced in our house. My parents stared at me as if I'd started speaking a foreign language, and I realized that this might be the first time in my adult life that I'd directly contradicted their guidance without immediately backing down. "Sarah," my father said finally, his voice carrying a warning tone I hadn't heard since childhood, "you're making a very serious mistake. We've invested a lot of time and energy in helping you navigate this transition, and you're throwing it all away for some fantasy about saving the world through therapy." "I'm not throwing anything away," I replied, though my hands were shaking under the table. "I'm just having one interview. If it doesn't work out, I still have the accounting offer to consider." "No," my mother said sharply. "You don't. Mr. Henderson specifically said he was looking for someone committed to building a career in his field. If you start playing games with his offer, he'll withdraw it and find someone who actually wants the position." The threat was clear. Choose their approved path now, or risk losing it entirely while chasing after impractical alternatives. It was the same ultimatum they'd been presenting in various forms throughout my life, and I'd always chosen their version of safety over my own authentic interests. But this time felt different. Maybe it was the memory of Amy's excitement about her work, or the realization that I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt passionate about anything, or simply the accumulated weight of years of small compromises that had added up to a life I barely recognized as my own. "Then that's a risk I'll have to take," I said, and the words felt like jumping off a cliff. The conversation continued for another hour, but the fundamental dynamic had shifted. They were no longer guiding a compliant daughter toward sensible choices. They were trying to convince an increasingly independent adult to abandon her own judgment in favor of their preferences. The difference was subtle but profound, and it changed everything about how I heard their arguments. When I finally excused myself and went to my room, I felt simultaneously exhilarated and terrified. I'd crossed a line I'd never even approached before, asserting my right to make my own decisions despite their strong objections. The independence felt intoxicating and overwhelming in equal measure. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the conversation, alternating between pride and my newfound assertiveness and panic about the consequences of disappointing my parents so directly. They'd devoted years to shaping my choices, and I was rejecting their guidance in favor of my own uncertain instincts. But lying in the dark, I also felt something I hadn't experienced in years: excitement about my own life. For the first time in memory, I was making a choice based on what I wanted, rather than what would minimize conflict or maximize approval. The sensation was both foreign and familiar, like reconnecting with a part of myself I'd forgotten existed. Friday morning arrived with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I put on a different suit, one I'd chosen myself rather than one my mother had selected, and drove to the family therapy practice with a sense of purpose that felt both thrilling and natural. The practice occupied a converted house in a quiet neighborhood, with warm colors and comfortable furniture that immediately felt more welcoming than the sterile office environment I'd experienced earlier in the week. The director, Dr. Patricia Williams, greeted me with genuine warmth and led me to her office, which was filled with plants and books and photographs that spoke of a life rich with personal meaning. Our conversation felt less like an interview than like a discussion between colleagues who shared similar interests and values. She asked about my theoretical orientation, my thoughts on family systems theory, and my ideas about working with adolescents who were struggling with identity and family relationships. For the first time in months, I found myself speaking with passion and confidence about professional topics that genuinely excited me. Amy wasn't exaggerating about your insights, Dr. Williams said after I described my approach to understanding family dynamics. You have a natural understanding of how family patterns develop and perpetuate themselves. That's not something that can be taught. It's a gift that can be developed through training and experience. The conversation lasted 2 hours, and by the end, she was offering me a position with more enthusiasm than I'd expected. The salary was modest compared to the accounting offer, but the benefits included comprehensive health insurance, professional development funds, and the kind of supervision and mentorship that would help me grow as a clinician. I know this is a big decision, she said as she walked me to the door, and I don't expect an immediate answer. But I hope you'll seriously consider joining our team. We need people who understand that this work is about more than just techniques and interventions. It's about genuine human connection and healing. Driving home, I felt like I was seeing the world with new eyes. The possibility of doing work that aligned with my values and utilized my education felt revolutionary after months of preparing for a career that held no appeal for me. But I also knew that accepting this position would require a level of independence from my parents' expectations that I'd never attempted before. The confrontation I'd been dreading came that evening at dinner. My parents had spent the day discussing my situation, and they were prepared with a united front designed to convince me to abandon what they saw as a dangerous fantasy and return to sensible decision-making. We've been thinking about your interview today. My father began with the measured tone he used for serious family discussions, and we're very concerned about the direction you're heading. This therapy position might seem appealing now, but you need to think about long-term consequences. My mother nodded in agreement, adding, "We've done some research on starting salaries in that field, Sarah, and the numbers are quite sobering. Even if you get this job, you'll be struggling financially for years. Is that really the kind of life you want for yourself?" They presented their case methodically, covering every practical objection they could think of: the low salary, the emotional stress of clinical work, the limited advancement opportunities, the unstable funding that affected many mental health programs. Their arguments were logical, well-researched, and delivered with the kind of caring concern that made them difficult to dismiss outright. But something fundamental had changed in how I processed their guidance. Instead of hearing their words as absolute truths about the nature of career success. I recognized them as opinions based on their values and priorities, which didn't necessarily align with mine. I understand your concerns, I said when they finished their presentation, but this work feels right to me in a way that accounting never could. Sometimes financial considerations aren't the most important factor in choosing a career. The local that passed between my parents contained years of shared frustration with my apparent inability to prioritize practical matters over emotional preferences. They'd spent decades trying to teach me their approach to life, and I was rejecting their wisdom in favor of what they saw as naive idealism. Sarah, my mother said with exaggerated patience, feelings change. You might be excited about therapy work now, but what happens when the novelty wears off and you're facing the reality of trying to pay rent on a nonprofit salary? You can't eat job satisfaction. And what about your student loans? My father added, those payments don't care how meaningful your work feels. You have real financial obligations that require real income to address. Their concerns were legitimate, and I couldn't deny that choosing the therapy position would involve financial sacrifices compared to the accounting offer. But for the first time in my adult life, I found myself believing that those sacrifices might be worth making if they allowed me to do work that felt authentic and meaningful. I know the money will be tight, I acknowledged, but I think I'd rather struggle financially while doing work I care about than be comfortable in a job that feels like a prison sentence. The word prison seemed to hit them like a physical blow. My mother's face went pale, and my father's jaw tightened in a way that suggested he was working hard to control his temper. A prison sentence? My mother repeated, her voice rising despite her obvious efforts to stay calm. Sarah, we're talking about a respectable career with good people who want to help you succeed. How can you characterize that as imprisonment? Because it's not what I want to do, I said simply. Because every day would feel like pretending to be someone. I'm not in order to meet other people's expectations about who I should be. The conversation that followed was the most intense we'd ever had about my future. They accused me of being ungrateful for their guidance and support, immature in my approach to career planning, and unrealistic about the challenges of adult life. I found myself defending not just my career choice, but my right to make choices that they didn't approve of. We're trying to protect you from making a mistake you'll regret for the rest of your life, my father said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine concern. We've seen what happens to people who choose careers based on passion instead of practicality. It's not pretty, Sarah. We don't want that struggle for you. But what if the real mistake would be spending my life in a career that never felt right? I asked, what if the struggle you're trying to protect me from is actually worth it compared to the alternative? The question seemed to genuinely puzzle them. In their worldview, career satisfaction was a luxury that responsible adults couldn't afford to prioritize. Work was work, a means of supporting yourself and your family, not a source of personal fulfillment or self-expression. That's not how the real world works, my mother said firmly. People don't get to do exactly what they want for a living. They do what needs to be done, and they find satisfaction in providing for themselves and their families responsibly. But as she spoke, I found myself thinking about the sketch pad I'd discovered in our attic years earlier, filled with her drawings from before she'd gotten serious about real life. Had she chosen to give up her artistic interests, or had they been gradually trained out of her the way mine had been systematically discouraged throughout my childhood? Mom, I said gently, do you ever miss drawing? I remember those sketches you used to do. They were beautiful. Her face went through a series of emotions, surprise, nostalgia, and then a kind of defensive sadness. That was a long time ago, Sarah. I put away childish things when I became an adult and took on real responsibilities. But what if they weren't childish? What if they were part of who you really are? The question hung in the air between us, and for a moment, I saw something vulnerable in my mother's expression, a flicker of the artist she'd once been before she'd learned to prioritize practicality over passion. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the familiar mask of parental authority. "This isn't about me," she said sharply. "This is about you making a decision that could affect the rest of your life. We're trying to help you avoid the kind of regret that comes from choosing dreams over reality. But what if the real regret would come from choosing other people's reality over my own dreams?" I countered. The following Monday, I made 2 phone calls that would change the trajectory of my life. The first was to Mr. Henderson, politely declining his job offer and thanking him for the opportunity. The second was to Dr. Williams, accepting the position at the family therapy practice and expressing my excitement about joining their team. Both conversations were easier than I'd expected, though for different reasons. Mr. Henderson was disappointed but understanding, wishing me well in my chosen field and keeping the door open for future opportunities should my circumstances change. Dr. Williams was delighted, immediately launching into discussions about start dates, orientation procedures, and the cases I'd be working with once I was fully integrated into their program. The contrast between the 2 calls was striking. One represented the path my parents had chosen for me, safe, practical, and completely disconnected from my actual interests. The other represented the path I was choosing for myself, uncertain, challenging, and aligned with everything I'd studied and hoped to accomplish professionally. My parents' reaction to these decisions was more subdued than I'd anticipated. There was no dramatic confrontation, no ultimatums or threats of withdrawn support. Instead, there was a kind of cold disappointment that felt almost worse than anger. Would have been. They were polite but distant, treating me like a houseguest who'd overstayed her welcome rather than their daughter who'd made a choice they disagreed with. "I hope you know what you're doing," my mother said when I told them about accepting the therapy position. Her voice was carefully neutral, but I could hear the hurt underneath. "We won't always be here to help when things don't work out the way you're expecting." The implication was clear. I was on my own now, having rejected their guidance in favor of my own questionable judgment. The safety net they'd provided throughout my life was being withdrawn, not out of cruelty, but as a natural consequence of choosing independence over their continued involvement in my decision-making. That first week at the family therapy practice was a revelation. The work was challenging in ways I'd never anticipated, emotionally demanding, intellectually complex, and requiring a level of authentic human connection that I'd forgotten I was capable of. But it was also deeply satisfying in a way that I couldn't have imagined when I was preparing for interviews in accounting firms. My first client was a 15-year-old girl named Emma who was struggling with anxiety and conflict with her parents. As I listened to her describe feeling misunderstood and controlled by, well,